Hi, my name is Commander Dave Wallace. I'm one of the permanent military professors here in the leadership department. And I want to give you an overview of this week's topic, talking about the role of the leader in leadership. So if you remember back to our idea of the process of leadership, in which the leader is, and then the leader behaves in certain ways, and those are separate things. We're going to talk more about that this week. And then followers react to those behaviors. And then finally, those follower behaviors result in some level of effectiveness, some measure of leadership outcomes. And the situation plays an overall role in this. Well, this week we're going to be discussing particularly the leader and the leader behaviors, and a little bit about how the situation influences those leader behaviors going forward. So first I want to talk a little bit about history and our understanding of leader attributes when we look at leadership and when we study leadership. So the study of leadership is really, it's as old as humans, but it's really begun in earnest really since the advent of psychology as a science. So around the mid 1800s, psychology started to come into its own as a science in the study of humans, the human mind, and human behavior. And one of the first questions that started to get asked was about leadership. And there was this idea that some people were really good leaders and other people were not very good leaders. And maybe we could figure out who was who, and maybe we could select people to be great leaders, or we could find out what happened and we could train other people. So the way that this was developed initially is what we've come to know, what has come to be known as the great man theory of leadership. And the reason we call it the great man theory is because when psychologists of the late 1800s looked around and looked for leadership and looked for great leaders, who did they turn to? Well, they turned to men because that was who was occupying the leadership positions at the time. And they just didn't think of it in terms of other people being able to lead. So they looked around, they looked at what they considered to be great men. And if we're being honest, we'd say great white men. And we looked at their attributes to try and figure out if we could figure out what made the best leaders. And the reality is, as they looked at great leaders across different situations, they really couldn't decide on any particular attributes that got there. Do we need a leader who's tall? Well, some leaders are short, look at Napoleon. Do we need somebody who's really intelligent? Well, intelligence isn't everything. Do we need leaders who are very aggressive? Well, sometimes we need leaders who are more thoughtful and more caring. It really depended on the situation. Well, this was the case all the way up until the late 1940s when a man named Roger Stockdill wrote a seminal article in which he said, you know, we're just never going to find that trait. What we really need to look for is the influences of the situation on how people develop leadership and how they rise to the occasion. That we need to not just ignore the person, but essentially focus on the situation as the ruler of leadership and recognize that some people will just rise to the occasion. Well, this lasted for maybe 10 or 20 years until people started to say, you know, there's probably what we might consider to be an interaction between the leader and the situation. So a man named Fred Fiedler kind of did the first realization of this, and he came up with what he called contingency theory, where he said, okay, well, some people do well in some situations and don't do well in other situations, but maybe person B does well in that second situation. So he came up with the idea that we needed to match who a leader is with the types of situations in which they will lead well. That lasted until really into the 1980s when a couple things happened. Number one, personality theory had really started to come into the fore. So if we talk about when they were looking for traits in the late 1800s and early 1900s, we didn't really have good theories of personality that gave us ideas about how to study traits. And really in the 1980s and 1990s is when, and it started much longer before this, but really personality theory started to get nailed down and we started to have good understandings of personality. I'm not sure, I wouldn't say we're all the way there, but we at least have some ideas. And so now we could go back and look at the personalities of leaders in a much more academically rigorous way. And the other thing we came to realize is that just because someone has a personality or just because someone has certain traits doesn't mean they can't change them. And really the big realization in leadership research was that it wasn't so much who someone is as how they behave, and particularly how well they are able to change their behaviors to meet the demands and needs and affordances of the situation. Now, it's a tricky topic. What I'm not trying to suggest here is that we are just a bunch of role actors and we just go with the winds and do whatever is required of us. There's still this kind of central moral code or central idea of what we believe about leadership that we want to maintain, be true to. And that's where we get what I call authentic flexibility. And it's this idea of being able to be flexible to the needs of the followers and the needs of the situation while still being authentic to a core code. You certainly learned a lot in NE 203 about the needs to have a core ethical code and to understand ethics and to act with integrity and to really to be the rock when others around need that rock of integrity. At the same time, what we're teaching you here is that you need to be flexible. You need to read who the followers are, you need to read what the situation is, and you need to alter your behaviors in order to get the most effective outcomes. At the same time, you need to be authentic to who you are. Now, that doesn't mean if you're a jerk, you get to just be a jerk because you're being authentic to yourself. What it does mean is that you maintain an internalized moral perspective, and then you change your behaviors according to the situational demands while maintaining truth in that authentic internal perspective. Look, I just threw a lot on you. That's a pretty hard stuff. That's varsity level leadership, but that's really what's going to get you there. So we're going to talk over this week about the leader and who the leader is, how the leader behaves, and then we'll talk a little bit about how the situation influences all of that. So as a big overview, here's this idea that your behaviors are a function of your ability, your motivations, and also situational influences. I know that's not a very clean equation, but just to understand that your behaviors are driven or at least influenced by all three of these things. When we talk about abilities, we're talking about intelligence. We're talking about your knowledge and your skills, your ability to perceive things and to understand the world around you. When we talk about motivations, we're talking about values and character. We're talking about needs and desires of the person. And frankly, we're talking about personality. Personality is a driver of motivation. And finally, when we talk about the situation, there are different things that the situation demands of us or permits us to do. And there are certain aspects of the situation that you're going to need to consider when you're making decisions about what behaviors to enact. What outcomes do you expect? Thinking about them in the long term and the short term. What are your followers' abilities? What are their motivations? What kind of time do you have in order to execute the mission? What are the power and relationships involved in the team that you're leading? What are the group and individual commitment to you, to the success of the mission? Who has the expertise? Are you the expert or other people the expert? Lots of different questions that we need to think about when we're considering the situation. And look, we're going to have time to cover every single aspect of abilities, motivations, and situations. I want you to have a broad idea that each of these, ability, motivation, and situation, influence how we behave. No single one of these drives how we behave. And really, ultimately, I want everybody to understand that we are people of free will, and we get to choose how we are going to behave based on our abilities, motivations, and the situation. So again, we're not going to be able to get into every one of these. I've highlighted here on this PowerPoint in red some areas that we are going to dive into this week. We're going to talk about theories of intelligence. Now, intelligence can be thought of as a skill driving our behaviors. We're going to talk about perceptions and particularly how cognitive biases affect our perceptions. We're going to talk about personality and what personality is and what it means. And we're going to talk about, in a situational aspect, we're going to talk about power and relationships between leaders and subordinates. So first, just a quick overview of intelligence, and we're going to dive much more deeply into this over the course of the week. But first, just a quick overview to two pieces. One, when we talk about intelligence, we often adhere to what we call now this triarchic view of intelligence: analytical, practical, and creative intelligence. You'll learn about each of these, and each of these has a role to play in leadership. There's also this idea of emotional intelligence or social intelligence. This is about how able and willing you are to be aware of your own emotions, and also how well you're able to perceive the emotions of others and act around them. So that's what we're going to talk about when we talk about intelligence. We're also going to talk about what we call cognitive biases. And cognitive biases are biases that affect us really unconsciously. They're not things that we can really affect. They're going to happen no matter what we do. And they're going to affect the way we perceive the world around us, the way we make decisions about what we're going to do, and the way in which we act. So we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into what cognitive biases are, but they really do affect our leadership because they affect how we view the world around us and how we make decisions about how to act. And then we're also going to talk about personality. Now, when we talk about personality in this class, we'll largely be talking about the Big Five or the five-factor model. You'll find that in the reading. It's really the most popular and well-used among psychologists, at least, personality measures and this idea of ocean. And there will be a longer piece on this that you'll get to watch later. I do want to emphasize that there are more than one personality assessment in the world. You're probably familiar with MBTI. You may be familiar with something called DISC. There's also Hexaco. There's other measures of various aspects of personality like narcissism and Machiavellianism. There's lots of different measures. We tend to focus on the Big Five because it's well validated and it's a really good measure overall. There's been a lot of studies in the relationship of various Big Five personality traits to leadership, which is why we really focus our attention there. But there's lots of different assessments. But really, when we're talking about personality, we're talking about your, like I said, it's motivational, your behavioral preferences. This is a measure of just your proclivities for certain behaviors, how you prefer to be. It doesn't drive, it doesn't dictate your behavior. You don't have to do a thing because your personality is that way. You get to choose what your personality, or excuse me, what your behaviors are. But your personality is certainly going to have an influence, especially if you're not putting intentional, conscious thought into your behaviors, then absolutely personality is going to come to the fore. When we measure personality, we're looking at trends over time. We look at all of your past behaviors, and then we start to come up with an assessment of, since you did all of these things, we think that your personality is this. Again, it's a trend over the long term. It doesn't necessarily dictate behavior in the particular moment. Also, different people have different ideas about how, I shouldn't even say their ideas, they have different, what we call strong versus weak personalities. People with what we call a strong personality, their personality really does drive their behaviors. People who have a weaker personality allow the situation to have more influence on them. The reality is, even though weak sounds like a pejorative, when we talk about good leadership, what we're really looking for is this weaker personality. And this idea of being able to mold your behaviors to the follower and to the situation. Look, I'm just touching the surface here on personality to kind of whet your appetite. We'll talk more about it throughout the week, but I just want to get some of these ideas out to you. And then finally, for an aspect of the situation, we're going to talk about power and social power. And certainly you've learned about this before, and we're going to touch on it again. Hopefully you recognize French and Raven's sources of social power: legitimate power, reference power, expert power, reward power, and coercive power. We're going to talk about that, and you're going to watch some videos on that dive a little bit deeper. But what I want you to think about in terms of power is that it is an influence in the situation, and particularly it's derived from the relationship between the leader and the follower, between you and the leader, between you and other people. Power without other people is not a thing. Power is a social construct. It's about our relationship with others and how much ability it gives us to influence their behaviors and ways that we can do it. The other thing to be aware of is different relationships and different sources of power become salient to us or come to the front of our brain at different times, right? So sometimes, especially when I put on my uniform and I'm giving orders, I'm really aware of my legitimate power. Whereas other times when I'm asking somebody to do something as a friend, then I'm really aware of that reference power relationship, even if those two situations might be about the same person. So again, power is derived from the relationship. It's not about a single person having power. It's about a shared understanding of the relationship between two people. This relates back to some of that narrative identity building that we talked about when we talked about who is the leader and who is the follower. Some of that is about building the power between the two and the power that's going to derive from those identity narratives. So when we talk about bringing this all together, it kind of looks something like this, where leaders have certain traits and certain abilities, and then they take a look at the situation. And their ability to even understand the situation goes back to that emotional intelligence, social intelligence, so they can understand their followers and they can understand the situation around them. At the same time, they have to have this ability to be flexible in their behaviors. When they are flexible in their behaviors and when they accurately perceive the situational demands from the followers and other pieces of the context, then they choose functional leadership behaviors that are going to lead to functional outcomes and good leadership outcomes. So that's what we're going to be talking about this week. Look, this week is a lot of information. In the first week, it was really about introductions and just getting you familiar with the material. This week, there's a lot of content. There's a lot of reading. There's a lot of videos. There's a couple of audios. We're even going to give you some supplemental information if you want to take some deeper dives. But I really encourage you to look ahead and jump in as early as possible and set some time aside to go over all these things, because we're going to cover a lot of material over the course of this week.